Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking an incredibly dense and, honestly, absolutely fascinating intersection between macro-political philosophy and bare metal decentralized tech architecture. I mean, we are going to explore how massive shifts in global power structures directly impact the actual hardware sitting right there on your desk. And definitely, more importantly, how you can actually maintain your own sovereignty in a rapidly changing digital landscape. It's a lot to cover, but it's totally worth it.
So, here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the clash of Leviathans. Then, the ideologies of the establishment. Third, the cloud empire enclosure. Fourth, escaping to the leaf. And finally, the rise of sovereign pilots. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. The Clash of Leviathans. Now, what's really interesting here is how the source materials frame human history. They look at it through the continuous shifting of centralized overarching powers, basically the forces that dictate how society coordinates. In the 1800s, the dominant organizing force, the Leviathan, was God and religious authority. But by the 1900s, that shifted to the state Leviathan, where the threat of legal and military force was what kept order. But today, in the 2000s, the sources argue that this legacy state Leviathan is being rapidly challenged. It's being eclipsed by a totally new emerging power, the network Leviathan, which is driven by cryptography, social consensus, and digital algorithms.
The authors argue that as this massive shift happens, the modern U.S. establishment has basically ossified. So rather than functioning as this dynamic, democratic structure, the texts describe it as having turned into an extractive Leviathan. It's become this centralized mechanism whose primary function is seizing and extracting resources from its own citizens just to maintain its grip on power. And this isn't just some abstract history lesson, right? This is a dynamic the texts argue we are literally living through right now.
And that brings us to a really profound observation from the text. Quote, "When Leviathans wrestle, when Godzilla fights King Kong, the earth trembles." Think about that. The deep instability we feel in the world today, the institutional decay, all the culture wars, it's described by the text not just as random chaos, but as a direct, seismic clash between the legacy state desperately holding on and the emerging network rising up.
Moving on to Section 2, Ideologies of the Establishment.
And this brilliantly illustrates how these Leviathans actually capture and maintain their power. The sources look at the ideological life cycle. Throughout history, movements usually start as a revolutionary class with this passionate manifesto, challenging the status quo. But eventually, they compromise. They win, they capture the institutions, and then, they become the exact ruling class they once fought against. The ideology morphs. It goes from being a revolutionary tool into a mechanism used purely to justify their new, centralized power.
Now, the sources apply this exact cycle to modern politics, and they make a very direct analytical parallel here. The authors argue that just as the Soviet ruling class used communism, as centralized, state-first ideology focused on the working class to justify its extractive empire back in the 20th century, the modern establishment uses wokeness. The texts frame this modern ideology as a decentralized, network-first doctrine focused on identity, which they claim is now being utilized by the ruling class to maintain strict control over our digital and cultural networks.
This brings us to a massive geopolitical flippening that's mapped out in the documents. The texts claim that what they call woke capital has effectively become the official ideology of America's ruling class. And just like past empires used grand moral narratives to justify their expansion and domestic control, the authors argue this modern ideology is deployed to justify extreme centralization, network capture, and ultimately the suppression of digital dissent.
Section 3. The Cloud Empire Enclosure.
So, because this macro-political capture isn't just theory, it actually translates directly into the architecture of the web. It creates what's essentially a modern digital enclosure for everyday users like you and me. And it does this through a really tricky mechanism called interface inversion. Think about it. In a healthy system, you use a tool, right? But in a centralized cloud empire, the tool manages you. It intercepts your intent, meters out intelligence like you're paying a monthly water bill, and basically dictates the terms. You are reduced to a digital tenant, just quietly renting access from some invisible, centralized tech monarch.
And the terms of this tenancy? They're incredibly predatory, mostly because of a concept called agentic tort. Since modern AI is probabilistic, which really just means it's often guessing, it is going to inevitably make mistakes. The sources highlight that centralized companies force the legal and ethical liability of these failures onto you, the user. You're positioned as what they call a moral crumple zone, meaning when the AI messes up, you take the legal blame and all the damage, while the tech giants safely extract all the financial value from the cloud. It's a pretty wild setup.
The documents use this wonderfully visceral metaphor to contrast these two realities. On one hand, you have the cloud empire. In this scenario, you are essentially a caged squirrel, constantly monitored and just occasionally fed by a corporate landlord. On the other hand, you have the decentralized forest. Here, you are a sovereign squirrel. You hide your own nuts, your own data, and you retrieve them for local execution. You become an independent node in a thriving ecosystem, completely bypassing that centralized landlord.
Let's move to Section 4 and see how this builds. Escaping to the leaf.
So, the big question, how do we actually break out of the cloud and become that sovereign squirrel? Well, the answer lies in leaf node logistics. To achieve true agentic sovereignty, the sources argue you absolutely must migrate away from the centralized trunk of the network. You have to opportunistically manage your own state, data, and logic locally. It means executing code on physical hardware that you actually possess, right out at the extreme physical edges of the network.
Now, connecting our messy human intent to that local hardware requires a flawless translation layer, which the texts call the semiotic bridge. And there is this absolutely awe-inspiring quote describing the process. You are quite literally tricking rocks into thinking using lightning and text. I mean, how cool is that? We take silicon substrates, literally rocks, pump electrical currents through them, lightning, and use precise deterministic text to force them to execute our exact human will. There's no magic here, just pure deterministic architecture.
The sources dive deep into a protocol called ERC7827 to show exactly how this bridge works in practice. It's fascinating. Step 1 anchors you. A lust-in first-out, or LIFO root hash, securely anchors your data on the blockchain. Step 2 legalizes you. A Kali wrapper takes your real-world entity and wraps it into a legal smart contract. Step 3 verifies you. A cryptographic record of sweat mathematically proves your actual manual human effort. And finally, Step 4 executes it all. That verified on-chain state triggers physical execution out at the leaf node, like sending an electrical signal through the GPIO pins of a local device, affectionately called the cheerbot. This is abstract code directly triggering physical reality.
Section 5. Rise of Sovereign Pilots.
Okay, so we have the decentralized architecture, but to truly wield it, your role as a user has to fundamentally transform. The crucial point here is that you must abandon the fragile, bloated graphical user interfaces. You know, the standard buttons and menus that basically treat you like a passive consumer. Instead, the sources demand the use of an agentic typewriter, a secure command line interface, or CLI. The CLI enforces strict, unalterable text logs that completely bypass the probabilistic miasma of AI guessing. It is pure, unmediated, undeniable digital truth.
And operating that CLI requires genuine effort, which leads to a philosophical concept the researchers call hexadicity. This is the absolute, undeniable uniqueness of a physical action in time. It proves that a specific human being applied the sweat of the brow to manually steer the machine. You aren't just passively generating content as some victim of the Leviathan. You are stepping up, taking absolute liability, and actively proving your sovereign intent.
The core thesis of this entire architectural breakdown is beautifully simple. The machine is merely a deterministic scripter. Think of it as a rigid brush. It has no soul, no vision, and no intent of its own. AI should never be allowed to act as an unpredictable king up in the cloud. The human must always remain the sovereign pilot, firmly grasping the brush to paint their exact intent onto reality.
Which leaves us with a final, really provocative thought, derived directly from the texts. As the tech giants aggressively push for a total digital enclosure by 2026, you have a fundamental choice to make. Will you passively remain a captive digital tenant, renting probabilistic guesses from an invisible Leviathan and basically acting as a corporate moral crumple zone? Or will you apply the sweat of your brow, grasp the sword of the command line, and ride as the sovereign orchestrator of your own machine? The future of authorship and agency really does depend on your answer. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.